And now I'm unmuted. I always got to remember that one. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We've got a great program lined up for you. My name is Christine von Kallnitz. I'm the chair of the Robert Lund's Group Sierra Club, and we represent Berkeley, Charleston, Colleton, and Dorchester, and we've got over 1,400 members. And just to let you know, the club's mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. So tonight's presentation definitely fits right in there. So wanted to let you know some of our leaders. They're on the call as well. And excuse me. Yvonne Michelle is our treasurer, and she is retiring from being treasurer. So we're looking for a new treasurer. So if anyone is interested, please reach out to me, and we'll have a discussion about it and let you know. It's during COVID especially, we're really not doing a whole lot. So most of our positions, the activity required right now especially is not that high. So this would be a great time to get in there and learn something new, and to sort of slowly be able to learn, while things are slow. Thank you to all of the leaders for everything you do. All right, I did want to turn it over to Star Hazard. He is our outings chair, and he is going to go over some outings. And I hope he is on the call. I couldn't see. There were so many people. He's supposed to be here.
So Sierra Club will not be leading any official outings until after the 4th of July. Obviously, this is a COVID-19 situation. However, we've been trying to suggest things for you to do. And one of the things that you can pretty nearly always do is drive out to Sullivan's Island and walk the boardwalk out there. Now, as many of you know, there's an ongoing controversy on the island. It turns out when land accretes on a barrier island, a forest will follow. And this has happened. And there is a controversy about leaving the forest alone or cutting it down. And the controversy is that people who spent millions of dollars to have their houses with the ocean view are beginning to have to look at a maritime forest, and they feel like they've been deprived of something. And they are petitioning to have that forest trimmed down. What they do, get some kind of clippers and bring it down to a fairly short level. Well, if you have an opinion about this, you can voice that in a variety of different ways. And the Stop the Chop petition is indicated there. If you need an actual URL, we could probably paste that into the chat room a little bit later. And for those of you who go out to the islands and know where stations 16 to 28.5 are, this is the region in question. So this is definitely in our backyard, and probably something you'd want to go out and have a look at, which you can do now at your leisure at any time, and you can possibly have an impact by signing the petition. The club itself, again, isn't going to be doing any outings. We've pointed out some URLs and links and so forth to things that you can go do on your own, and there are various places around from the
Sorry.
the one that's
you want to go back or you want to go forward?
Forward one. Okay, so what shows there is the Swamp Fox section of the Palmetto Trail, and this section begins on Highway 17 North and goes about 6 miles up to the Halfway Creek Road, and it covers lots of different kinds of habitat from low country to pine plantations that are longleaf pine. You'll walk through or by something called a pocosin, which is a lovely thing to see. And this is the best time of year to go out because the mosquitoes aren't so active. Now, if you want to go the other way from town, you can go down to the Donnelly Wildlife Management Area. And if you drive in from the main entrance on Highway 17, if you go no further than the first buildings there, you can get out and have a wonderful just walk in a kind of a beautiful, slightly upland woods. If you want to go a little further, I recommend that you go down and try and take the Boynton Trail hike, which is a lovely, relatively short hike. A little bit later in the season, you'll see hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of alligators.
Right.
And
And you might see a spoonbill.
Yeah, you might see many spoonbills actually.
Mm-hmm. That's the first place I saw one in the Low Country.
And another place that you should probably know about by heart, actually, is to go up to the Sentee Coastal Reserve. Now, this is basically a place that we have in perpetuity because people like to shoot ducks. And they bought the land after the upheavals of the Civil War, and it was carried on as a kind of a duck hunting reserve for years. But it was originally rice culture, makes wonderful habitat for wintering ducks. There's uplands, there's waterlands, there's rice dikes, there's the Santee River. It's one of the great places in the world, and if not South Carolina. There are a number of trails that you can go walk, and beginning on Sunday, you can walk out on the Yellow Trail, which is the Cape Trail. And that goes out to the Intercoastal Waterway through lots of rice dikes and so on. Anyway, this is a place that is rife with history, and it's plantation culture history, and now it's biology. Up until Saturday evening, they maintain the place for seasonal hunts. And on Sunday, they open up the Cape Trail and you can go out there and hike around and look. So it's one of the great places on earth. One of the great places, and you should get out there. If you are interested in further information about any of these sites and can't get them, come up on your web searches, you can give me a call and I'll try and respond with some information.
Thank you, Star. I hope to see everyone there Sunday.
So I guess I could say, if you want to come out on Sunday, we might go hiking. It depends a little bit on the weather. It's a little bit iffy with strong north winds right now, low chance of rain. It might be a little muddy. This isn't an official Sierra Club outing, so you didn't hear it from me. But if you want to show up there, we'll go for a hike of some distance. Not often we make this a 10-mile hike. We won't go quite so far this time. But we'll stop and listen to the birds, and we'll go for a hike and look for birds. We're looking for ducks mostly, but sometimes there are roseate spoonbills, and sometimes there are wood storks, and they're nearly always eagles. So it'll be a great hike.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Star. All right. So the South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement Program, famously named SCORE, they are starting to meet every Wednesday. So at 1 p.m., you can join volunteers from various groups and go to clean up the oyster shell. It comes mostly from restaurants, but also there are some other, people that bring in oyster shell, but sometimes there's some trash in it, maybe some recyclables. So it needs to be cleaned up before it can be reused put back into a oyster bed. So they're going to be doing that every Wednesday at 1 p.m. and they meet in North Charleston. You will need to RSVP. So you email the SCORE at dnr.sc.gov. They'll hold a spot for you. And they are keeping the COVID-19 restrictions. And of course, it's usually an outside event. So that's good. Bring your mask and have some fun and do something great for our Low Country. All right, before we get to tonight's program, I want to tell you a little bit about next month's program. Mike Sadler will be joining us. He's going to be talking about lessons learned from a long distance kayak journey from all the way from North Carolina to Charleston. So that should be a fabulous program as well. So we're looking forward to that and seeing you all again next month. Tonight's program, Dr. Peter Kingsley Smith, he's going to be talking about protecting Charleston's salt marshes through the creation of living shorelines. Coastal salt marshes are currently being lost at a higher rate than any other wetland habitat through sea level rise, increased storminess, coastline development, and shoreline hardening. Dr. Kingsley Smith received his BS in Marine and Environmental Science from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and his PhD from the University College of North Wales, Bangor. And he was studying the natural history of moon snails. From 2002 to 2008, Peter worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. He was researching the comparative ecology of native and non-native predatory gastropods and oysters. That brought him here, of course. In 2008, Peter moved to Charleston, South Carolina to accept the position of Shellfish Research Section Manager for DNR's Marine Resources Research Institute. He currently holds the position of Senior Marine Scientist. His research team implements a broad diversity of projects that focus on ecologically, recreationally, and commercially important bivalve and crustacean species, as well as coastal plain crayfish species and horseshoe crabs. Sounds like a fun job, right? Much of his recent research has focused on the ability of intertidal oyster reefs to act as natural breakwaters. We all need those right now. We need to protect ourselves from flooding, right? So they're protecting adjacent salt marshes from erosion, thereby addressing coastal habitat loss and promoting increased resiliency. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass it to Dr. Kingsley Smith. And we appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Christine. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'll get a quick couple of nods from some cameras if you can hear me well. Great. Had a few hiccups with some technology. I got multiple screens here, so hopefully this will send you the right thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen right now. So I'm hoping that you can see the presentation slide.
We can.
Okay, and you cannot see my notes, correct?
I cannot see your notes.
You don't want to see them, so I just want to make sure you're seeing the right screen.
And while you're talking, if anyone has a question, please put it in the chat function, and we will get to questions and answers after the presentation.
Great, thank you, Christine. Well, good evening. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this evening. It's a really great turnout. I think maybe that's reflective of the fact that we all sort of hold salt marshes in the Charleston area and in South Carolina close to our hearts. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for the Sierra Club for the invitation. I have a 20-month-old daughter, so I elected to do this meeting from my office, which is why that's background is here. So guaranteed quiet. So she's sleeping soundly. So that's good to know. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the goal for tonight is to talk to you a little bit about sort of why salt marshes of South Carolina estuaries are important, why they're facing some increased pressure, and how the DNR is working to protect them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some long-term restoration strategies that the DNR has been involved with, and then we'll spend sort of the second half of the talk talking more specifically about a new project that we've been able to get federal funding for to do some restoration work, specifically in Charleston County. So as I think everybody is probably aware, estuaries are a dominant feature of the South Carolina coastline, comprising networks of intertidal salt marshes. And this is an example of some sort of tidal creeks in the estuary in the Stono River area around Highway 17. And just to define estuaries, an estuary is an area where fresh water from the upland is mixed with salt water from the ocean. And so those waters are still salty, but not as salty as the ocean. So the illustration on the left here shows the distribution of salt marshes along the South Carolina coast, shown in green. And so, as I mentioned, these are a dominant feature of the South Carolina coastal landscape. And the numbers on the inset on this figure on the left show you the estimated number of acres of salt marsh habitat in each state, sort of from the mid-Atlantic down to Florida. And some of these numbers are a little bit different depending on how you categorize sort of wetlands or particular types of marshes. But the take home here is that South Carolina has an estimated approximately 400,000 acres of salt marsh habitat, which is a really big number, and more than Virginia and North Carolina. There's some debate as to whether or not Georgia has more than South Carolina, but nobody beats Florida, right? Because they have such a huge coastline. But importantly, salt marshes represent the second most biologically productive habitat on Earth. And they support a diversity of something called ecosystem services. And that term is used a lot, but I thought it was worth spending a little time defining exactly what we mean by ecosystem services. So I found this nice illustration actually from Scotland's Nature Agency, and it sort of categorizes what the 4 types of ecosystem services are. So ecosystem services, easy for me to say. Ecosystem services are the diverse benefits that are provided to humans by healthy natural ecosystems. And they can be divided into one of 4 categories, like shown here. And so those categories are cultural, and that includes things like enjoying the great outdoors, right? So we've talked a lot about the COVID pandemic in the last year or so, and it's been a cause of major stress for people. But one of the benefits that we have seen, at least from Department of Natural Resources perspective, is that enjoying the great outdoors has been something that people have still been able to do, even during the pandemic. So recreation, education, and tourism, those are some examples of cultural ecosystem services. The second category is maintaining, and so that's things like protecting upland habitat from storms, or storing something called blue carbon in the marshes, or stabilizing the sediment by trapping sediments in the marsh plants. The third category is supporting, and then a good example of that is sort of nutrient cycling. And so there's a lot of nutrient cycling that happens within the estuary, so things like carbon cycling, nitrogen cycling, that sort of thing. And then lastly, provisioning. And the example that I go to based on being the shellfish research section manager is support of fish and shellfish populations. It's worth noting that over 75% of all commercially important species in the Southeast use estuaries during some part of their life cycle. And this is particularly true for crustacean shellfish species such as shrimp and blue crabs, which support 2 of the most economically valuable fisheries in South Carolina. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about those. And these are some species that my section here at the Institute on Fort Johnson works on very intensively. So the first of these is white shrimp, and the figure on the left was created by Karen Swanson, who's now retired from DNR, but it's a really nice graphic illustration of the life cycle of the white shrimp, whose scientific name is Penaeus sativus. So white shrimp support a valuable commercial fishery in South Carolina and also an important part of the estuarine food web. And this illustration just shows you their life cycle. So white shrimp reproduce in the near coastal ocean. That's where that adult is, out there at the bottom of the figure. So they release their eggs into the water in the near coastal ocean, and then their larvae develop in the near coastal ocean and ultimately get washed back into the estuary as these post-larval and juvenile stages. And then white shrimp will grow up as juveniles in the salt marshes of the estuary. And then as they get larger and older, they move back down the estuary and ultimately move back out into the ocean. A proportion of these adult shrimp actually overwinter in the coastal ocean, and those shrimp that survive the winter will go on to produce the next generation of white shrimp. So clearly white shrimp are making use of salt marshes at critical parts of their life cycle. The other example, and another species that ranks really highly among the commercially valuable fisheries in South Carolina is the iconic blue crab, Calamectus sapidus. So salt marshes are really important to blue crabs as well, but in a slightly different way, because blue crab's life cycle is a little bit different to white shrimp in terms of where things happen. So adult blue crabs actually mate in the upper part of the estuary where it's lower salinity, and that's where that mating adults is shown up there. So remember from the previous slide, white shrimp were reproducing in the near coastal ocean, sort of at the bottom of the estuary, whereas blue crabs were actually mating in the upper part of the estuary. So mating happens up in those low salinity upper reaches of the salt marshes. And then once females have been mated, they'll actually migrate downstream and release their eggs actually at the mouth of the estuary. And then those eggs get washed out into the ocean, and larval blue crabs develop in the near coastal ocean and ultimately get washed back in or ingress back into the estuary and then grow up as juveniles in the salt marshes. So salt marshes are really important nursery grounds for juvenile blue crabs because they provide them with both nutrition as well as protection from predators. So I hope I've convinced you, if you needed convincing, maybe you didn't need convincing already, that salt marshes are really important ecologically. They support a lot of ecosystem services, as we've discussed. But I think as we acknowledge, they're under increasing pressure. So they're under pressure from increasing coastal development and human populations. And this is just a couple of examples of that. Human development is happening right at the interface between the land and the water. And so we talk about human populations expanding a lot in South Carolina. And just to put some numbers on that, South Carolina coastal county populations are projected to increase by 35% between the years 2005 to 2030. And I often hear the number of how many people are moving to Charleston County every day. I think it used to be about 40. I think that it was 50, maybe it's nearer to 60 now. So lots of people moving here, lots of development happening, lots of pressure on our estuaries. So some other pressures are things like boat wakes, and we talk a lot about this in the context of sort of shoreline erosion. So not to be negative about boaters, but boaters do create a lot of wakes, and those wakes ultimately make their way onto the shoreline, and those wakes can cause damage to fragile salt marsh habitats. And that's particularly true in places referred to as man-made navigational channels. So this photograph in the upper right is actually a photograph from Fenwick Cut, which is in the Ace Basin. Fenwick Cut is cut through Fenwick Island, and so there's now North and South Fenwick Island. And this was dredged by the Army Corps of Engineers for navigational purposes. It now connects the Ashepoo River with the South Edisto. And so that's important from navigation because it's enabled people to move through the waterways of South Carolina. But the problem is that because this channel is not a natural one, this channel doesn't have natural oyster reefs protecting its marshes, so it's experiencing a lot of erosion. We're also seeing habitat losses that are being exacerbated by sea level rise and increased storminess related to climate change. I believe in climate change. There you go. I'll go on record. So intertidal oyster reefs are important, and they can act as natural breakwaters. And so I use this photograph a lot because I think it really captures this close juxtapositioning of intertidal oyster reefs and the adjacent salt marshes behind them. And if you've been out on the shoreline at low tide and a boat's gone by and you look down the shoreline, you're probably able to see that when the waves hit that oyster reef, they dissipate that energy and they protect the marshes from that energy. And so it's really important to maintain this relationship between intertidal oyster reefs and the adjacent marshes. So in that previous slide, the reason that we're seeing marsh loss is because that's not a natural channel and it doesn't have natural oyster reefs present. So one thing that DNR has been doing for several decades now is to create new intertidal oyster reef. And the way that we do this is dependent upon sort of a basic understanding of oyster life cycles. So oysters as adults are sedentary. They can't move around once they're settled, but they do release their larvae in terms of eggs and sperm into the water column. Those eggs are then fertilized and develop into these things called veliger larvae, which typically swim around in the water column for about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on water temperatures. So they develop a little bit faster at higher temperatures, a little bit slower when it's colder. And then eventually those veliger larvae develop a foot, hence their name, pediveliger. And this is the settling stage. And at this point, they're sort of chemically attracted to something that they want to attach to. And they make good decisions, hopefully, because once they're attached and cemented to something, they can't get up and move. And so we refer to this process as sort of gregarious settlement, which means that young oysters like to settle on primarily the shells of older generations. And this process leads to these three-dimensional multi-generational reefs that we see. But South Carolina estuaries are referred to as something called substrate limited, which means that there are essentially, a simple way to think of it is there are more competent larvae swimming around in the water column looking for a home than there are services to attach to. So they're substrate limited. So if we provide suitable substrates at the right time of year and there are oyster larvae in the water column, then those oyster larvae will attach to the substrates and build new reefs. And DNR has used this strategy extremely effectively in South Carolina, taking advantage of sort of abundant natural reproduction in South Carolina. So we're fortunate in South Carolina that we have about 5,000 acres of intertidal oyster reefs. We've mapped those extensively. And so all of those oyster reefs are essentially reproducing and releasing larvae into the water column. So we have lots of larvae in the water column. There are some other states that don't have that. And those states are referred to as broodstock limited as opposed to substrate limited. And so you can think of broodstocks as being the parents. Basically, the adult population has been depleted so much that the population is limited by its abundance of broodstock. But going back to South Carolina, we're substrate limited here. So if we provide substrate, we can build new reefs. Some of you on the call may have volunteered with the SCORE program that Christine talked about. And this is a community-based volunteer program that uses bagged oyster shells, and those shells are derived from our recycling program. And then volunteers will place these bagged shell on the intertidal at low tide and develop new reefs. Some other strategies that we've used, again, putting material out that oyster larvae are attracted to, are using loose shell. And that allows us to basically create a larger footprint, if you will. And then the third and fourth strategy here are thirdly, oyster castles. These are basically Lego for restoration junkies, if you will. They're interlocking concrete blocks that you can put out on the shoreline. They provide some nice vertical relief, some structure, and they have a high calcium carbonate content, much like oyster shells, and so they attract oysters onto them. And then lastly, and this is something that I've been involved with my research section for about the last 10 years, is using repurposed crab traps. So basically taking derelict fishing gear and repurposing it as oyster reef substrate. So going back to the SCORE program, DNR has been leading community-based oyster reef restoration since about 2001. And this has engaged volunteers, as I mentioned, to place bag shell on the intertidal to catch wild oyster spat. And these spat quickly grow up and form new reefs. And in recent years, we've noticed that these reefs actually protect shorelines from erosion. In the early days of the SCORE program and in the early days of sort of oyster reef habitat restoration, we really focused on sort of the habitat value of these reefs in terms of the other organisms that were using them as habitat and on their water, filtration qualities. But in recent years, we've really started to focus on this shoreline protection function. And this is sort of the poster child of what happens when this works really well. So we can see an example of this ability from a time series of photographs from a SCORE program study site at Hunting Island in the southern part of the state. So this first photograph was taken in the spring of 2010. So I keep banging my desk, so it's not thundering, it's just my metal desk. So this is the shoreline in spring 2010, sort of a pre-restoration, sort of at the assessment stage. And maybe you can just see in the background that this marsh habitat is starting to break up and starting to erode. So this site was selected for restoration by the SCORE program. So shell bags were planted on the shoreline in the late spring, early summer of 2010. And then this photograph is taken in the fall of that year. And a couple of things that you'll see here is that we start to see sediment being trapped behind the bags. So that slightly lighter sand color is sediment that's being trapped by the oyster bags on the shell, on the shoreline, excuse me. And the other thing you might be able to see is that we've started to see oysters actually recruit to those bags. So you'll see that they're a little bit spiky. They have a little bit of vertical relief. And this is where we do the zoom drum roll. And so then 3 years later, this is a photograph taken at the same location from the same spot. And we have this really striking three-dimensional oyster reef that has grown up. And all of that lush green Spartina marsh grass is natural accretion. None of that is planted. So basically what has happened over the course of these 3 years is that the oyster reef has provided protection against sort of wave energy and physical disturbance to this area behind where the bags were placed. And then sediment accumulated, and then the marsh plants essentially naturally accreted and filled in behind the oyster reef. And this was really kind of an aha moment for us in terms of this idea of using intertidal oyster reefs to promote the reestablishment of marsh plants and to essentially reverse shoreline erosion and recreate these natural breakwaters. So the next slide is a little bit blurry. I apologize. I took it, but I acknowledged it, so I didn't steal it. This image is off NOAA's website. So that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And within NOAA, they have something called the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS. And this is their website that's specifically focused on something called living shorelines. And that's the term we started to use in terms of once we noticed that these oyster reefs created these new marshes and these new close relationships between the reef and the marsh, we started to talk about these as being living shorelines in the context of shoreline erosion. And so this slide is just intended to sort of capture some quotes from the NOAA Living Shorelines website. And those quotes are down the right-hand side of this slide. And then apologies, they're a little bit blurry, but the graphic sort of talks about some of the advantages of living shorelines compared to more engineered or armored structures, such as bulkheads and seawalls. And those two are shown sort of in that grayed out area. So if we go to these quotes on the right-hand side, we can define a living shoreline as being a protected, stabilized coastal edge made of natural materials such as plants, sand, or rock. And the important part of that is that living shorelines have some natural component to them. And unlike a concrete seawall or other hard structure, which impede the growth of plants and animals, living shorelines can grow over time, right? And so what they really mean by that is that living shorelines sort of maintain the continuum or the connection between the land and the water. And so they have the ability to grow and move and migrate with changes in sea level. And we can think of those as being resilient because they're able to move. And so sometimes living shorelines are also referred to as being nature-based, green, or soft. And they're an innovative and cost-effective technique for coastal management. So this green versus gray continuum is something that NOAA have also sort of illustrated in the following figure. And so we can think of green infrastructure as being sort of living shorelines. So again, incorporating some kind of natural component, as opposed to the other end of the continuum of gray being these hardened coastal structures, things like revetments and bulkheads. So back in 2019, we wrapped up a federally funded project supported by something called NOAA's NEAR Science Collaborative. And essentially this project was intended to generate the best available science in order to help inform DHEC, or the Department of Health and Environmental Control's Office of Coastal Resource Management, to try to develop new regulations about living shorelines. So prior to this project, there were no state-specific regulations to permit living shorelines in South Carolina, which meant getting a permit for a living shoreline took a long time and was really complicated. And so DHEC reached out to DNR and said, we'd like you to conduct a lot of monitoring and really help us understand sort of the science behind living shorelines. And this document is well worth a read if you're interested in some of that research and some of that science, and I'd be happy to share it with you, but it's also available online. And as a quick plug, it also received a notable document award from the State Library of South Carolina in 2020. So that's a little bit of background about what we've been doing up until sort of very recently in terms of living shorelines and also salt marsh restoration work. But for the rest of the talk today, I wanted to talk about this new project that we're currently working on. And so the DNR is continuing its restoration around living shorelines, and this current funding is from NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And this award is from something called the Community-Based Restoration Program, which supports coastal marine habitat restoration projects that identify specific concerns. And while DNR is the lead agency in terms of receiving this award, this is a collaborative project with both Clemson University's Cooperative Extension and South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. And I'm delighted to say that Evie Bell from Sea Grant is on the call with us today. So great to have her here as well. And so this particular project is entitled Community-Based Living Shoreline Creation in the Urbanized Watershed of Charleston County to support habitat resiliency and ecosystem services. So hopefully that project title now makes a little bit more sense. But the take home here is we really decided to focus this project within Charleston County. And the reason for that is that Charleston County has seen a really rapid increase in its amount of urban development. And so this figure is from a publication by Allen and Liu, published in 2003. And it shows the amount of urbanized land cover within the Charleston County watershed from 1973 to 2030. And so if we just take the two ends of that spectrum, in 1973, there was about 70 square miles of urbanized watershed within Charleston County. And it's projected that by 2030, that will be 868 square miles. So more than a 10-fold increase in urban development. So clearly Charleston County is experiencing a lot of development and a lot of pressure on its estuaries. And so we decided we would focus our project here. This is just a figure to show you where our restoration sites will be for this project. And this project is running from 2019 to 2022. So we've been slowed down a little bit by COVID, but we're still moving forward in a positive direction. But these are just an illustration of where we'll be working. And we'll be planting bagged shell as well as modified crab traps. We'll also be doing planting of Spartina. And at some of these sites, we'll be doing combinations of methods. That's what's shown in the black dots and in the diamonds. So most of these sites are focused in the Charleston Harbor and Ashley River system, but we also have some sites on Folly and down into the Edisto Island region as well. So I just wanted to touch on a few of the components to this project, so you have a sense of the type of activities that will be involved. So as I mentioned, it will have on-the-ground restoration, and that will include, again, the use of bagged shell, hopefully using volunteers, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A perhaps at the end. But we'll also be doing some loose shell planting. I mentioned that earlier as a long-term DNR strategy, and this just sort of walks you through how that process works. So for loose shell planting, in many cases, we'll actually buy shell from out of state, and because we need more volume than we can generate just through the shell recycling program. So this purchased shell is loaded onto a barge, and then we'll identify some shorelines like that shown in the top right-hand figure that are lacking in oyster reef habitat. We'll then take a barge and basically a water cannon out there at high tide, once we've marked out the area, and blast this shell overboard. And then that picture bottom right shows the shoreline after planting. That's immediately after planting, which is why those shells are nice and clean and white looking. But those shells will very quickly attract and collect spat and become new oyster reefs. Another strategy that we've started to use in my research section here at the Institute is these actually modified crab traps. So rather than repurposing marine debris, we're also prefabricating some of these modular units. And this may very well be something that we explore using with volunteers, as we may be able to do this with social distancing more easily than we can some of the bagged shell approaches. And then lastly, we'll actually be doing things with material called core logs. That's the fabric log you see here. And this is a photograph from a previous project. So we recognize that erosion is happening in parts of the coastal zone where salinities perhaps are lower than are supportive of oyster-based strategies. And so these core logs are essentially an idea to stabilize sediment and trap sediment and protect marshes without relying on the attraction of oysters. Another big component of the project will be to propagate and plant salt marsh plants. And this is something that South Carolina Sea Grant taking a lead role in terms of their partner role in our project. South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium has worked closely with DNR for a number of years now on a project called Seeds to Shoreline, which basically propagates Spartina plants and puts them out at restoration sites. And I was really excited recently to get some of these photographs from Roger Druin at South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, who shared them with me. Way better photographs than I have on hand, and way better than I could have taken. But I think they really kind of capture the spirit of this volunteer activity. So essentially in the sort of fall and winter months when the Spartina plants are in seed after they finished flowering, you can go out and collect these seeds and collect them up, and that's what they look like. Apparently they're a little spiky, so you have to be a little bit careful. But you can collect really high numbers of these seeds and bring them back to the lab. And one of my labs out here at Fort Johnson is is currently overwintering these seeds. And this is Gabriela DePetto, who works with the SCORE program, actually picking out the seeds that have started to germinate, to have a little sprout. You can see that container on our right, on her left, with the green in it. So picking out those seeds that have sprouted. And then those seeds get transferred into these trays, and they're under grow lights here in one of our labs. And then when they get big enough, they get transferred out to the greenhouse. This is one of the greenhouses out here at DNR. And then towards the spring of last year, the plants essentially were doing so well, they started outgrowing their home. And so we ended up transferring these and planting them out last spring. And this is an example of one of the study sites again. I don't know if that's Evie in that picture or not. Maybe it is. And I think this is out at Murrayville, one of the project sites for the current project, with some of these plants being put in the ground. The project is also intensively involving monitoring. Monitoring is a big part of what we do as part of our research section, because that allows us to really understand how these materials are performing and which sites are productive and more productive and less productive than others, and really try to understand the performance of some of these materials in a diversity of different environmental conditions. So one platform that we use for monitoring is actually, we have a drone, actually a couple of drones. The drones provide us with really great aerial imagery of the project sites, as well as generating really high resolution, accurate photographs. In video, they also allow us to build things called surface elevation models, which will actually show us how these marshes are changing in elevation, how the sediment is changing in elevation. So as well as being really fun to use and generating some really nice products, they're also a really valuable monitoring tool. We also have really accurate GPS equipment. This is a Trimble R8, and this allows us to generate centimeter resolution accuracy location information. And so that one example of why that's useful is we can actually track the movement of the marsh edge over time. And then some of our monitoring is not very sophisticated. It basically involves waders and boots and measuring things on the ground. So we're measuring the escarpment height here, and we can also use similar techniques to count densities of plant shoots. And sometimes these sites are really challenging and require a lot of people to measure lots of different things. So this is one of those core log sites, and we have folks measuring various aspects of this shoreline and how it's changing over time. And as I mentioned, the current project has volunteer or community engagement at all phases in it, and so we plan to engage the CESA Shoreline program and do some citizen science and train volunteers in order to monitor the salt marsh plantings that will be installed. And this is an example of some previous similar activities, photographed from Evie with some. I think these might be middle schoolers or maybe high schoolers actually out monitoring Spartina in the field. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time this evening, for joining me. I hope you've learned a little bit about salt marshes and why they're important, and learned a little bit more about this current project that we have that's funded by NOAA and NIMS. The COVID pandemic, I hate to bring it up, but it has been a little bit challenging in terms of our ability to engage groups of volunteers, but we are still hoping that that will change in the future. Later in hopefully 2021, we'll be able to engage volunteers. So I don't have a lot of specifics for that right now, but I did want to leave this slide up. We have a number of volunteer opportunity contacts that I'll just leave this up for. So Casey Ferguson at DNR, she's out here at Fort Johnson, and she coordinates sort of volunteer opportunities sort of out here at Fort Johnson. So she's a great person if you just have some fairly general volunteer interests. Secondly, Michael Hodges, who oversees the SCORE program. So things like the bagging events that we typically do, or doing shoreline restoration activities, that's Michael's shop. And then lastly, as a result of this funding from NOAA, from NIMS for the current project, excited to say that Sea Grant were able to hire a coastal intern to help us out with this project. And so that is Amanda Namson. I think she may be on the call as well today. And so Amanda is helping us to manage sort of volunteer interests, specifically for some of these salt marsh plant restoration activities associated with this new project. So If you have an interest in any and all of these things, then I'll just leave this up. Feel free to reach out to these folks directly by email. And even if we don't have opportunities for you right now, we are trying to capture sort of names and contacts of folks so that we can reach back out to them when hopefully things improve. So with that, thank you again for your time this evening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous information. We really appreciate that. And we do have several questions.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, but I'm going to leave. I'll share this presentation with Christine and with Laura. So if any of you want a copy of it, then you can get it from them. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing because I'm confused at looking at myself at 3 different places.
Oh. Okay, yeah, I understand.
I got a sore neck these last couple of weeks, and I was like trying to figure out why it was, and then I finally figured it out. It's like doing this all
these
day.
Screens. Oh boy, yeah. So one of our first questions was sort of not really a question, but it's talking about DNR. They say there's no regulation of boat wakes unless they are occurring next to commercial property. So this person is watching lots of damage to the marsh on James Island and the creeks this year. Do you
and that was me, and I asked DNR, can't we do something to these people that go by here at 70 miles an hour? And they said, no, it's not commercial, we don't care. Seems to me we should change that and make there be some consequence for really irresponsible boating that damages the marsh.
Any comments? You're on mute. Okay, there you go.
I try to not speak outside of my own responsibilities within DNR. So I mean, just to emphasize, my role at DNR is to conduct sort of research related to shellfish populations.
Okay.
But I understand your concern, and obviously, if there are boat wakes in place, and people are violating them, then we would hope that would lead to some action. But our law enforcement division is doing the best they can.
You are validating that lots of boat wakes are damaging the marsh.
Yeah, I mean,
okay. Well, that's helpful because they'll tell you, oh, that really doesn't do that much. Yeah. If you sit here and watch it, you think it does. But thank you.
Well, I think the extent of damage sort of depends on where exactly that boat wake is happening. And another comment that I've heard is that maybe some consideration should be given to where some of those boat wake zones start and end, because one of the things that produces the most amount of wave energy is boats actually coming off plane as they come into a no wake zone. That's actually when they throw some of the biggest wakes, right, when they're coming off plane. But yeah, not really my area of authority or responsibility. So, but I would say if you have concerns about it or in a specific place, then we can certainly direct your inquiries or your concerns within DNR to the appropriate people. Like I'm not saying I don't have all the answers, but I'd be happy to direct your concerns to the right people to give you a better answer.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. So I did want to let you know that we did get several comments that your graphics were fabulous and well done.
Thank you.
I appreciate that because I know you worked hard on that presentation and it was great. So another question is, how do oysters, I guess the spat, how do they get started on the mud flats? And are bags better than loose shell?
So the first question is, how do oysters get started on mudflats?
Right.
So when oyster larvae settle out of the water column, they're about 300 microns in diameter, right? So that's about 1/3 of a millimeter, right? So that's smaller than a pinhead, right? They're really, really small. So it might not look like there's anything on that mudflat, but really they just need something that's bigger than they are to attach to, if that makes sense. So that's why we see sort of localized small oysters on things that are largely mudflat. right? Because there is some substrate for them. They're attaching to something. But if we provide a more continuous sort of substrate layer by planting all this oyster shell or putting these bags out, we're basically making it easier for them to find something to attach to, right? Because we're providing a lot of surface area.
So the next question was, which is better, the bags or the shell?
So I would say that they're kind of apples and oranges, and I hate that cliche, but I use it a lot when I'm tired. What we really try to do is to match the strategy that we use in terms of restoration to the environmental conditions at that location, or to a particular project or a particular need. So there's not a universal this is better than that. So for example, if we want to create a really big footprint and we want to sort of supplement an area that's being recreationally harvested, then we'll do loose shell planting to put a lot of shell back onto that recreational ground. Most of the loose shell planting that DNR does is on recreational grounds because the money that we get to do it is from recreational fishing licenses. However, and so the bagged shell, and so there's also a difference because the bagged shell works really well for volunteers. Loose shell requires lots of machinery and doesn't lend itself to volunteer involvement, right? We don't really let anybody drive around with a barge and a water cannon, even though they'd probably really enjoy it. So there's some logistics that are different. And also, loose shell doesn't work in all places. So loose shell wouldn't work well in a really high wave environment because the wave energy would basically pick up those shells and wash them up into the marsh, and then they would essentially become unavailable for oyster recruitment, right? Whereas oyster shell bags, they probably weigh about 25 to 30 pounds. So if you put them on the shoreline, they're not going to get washed away, right? So they're going to stay put. So it's not that loose shell or bag shell are better or worse because they're both based on natural oyster shell material. It's just that their application is different, or where they might work, or what we're trying to achieve in a particular place is different. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so another example of that is these repurposed crab traps, right? Because there are places in South Carolina which are really, really muddy. Like you'll jump out the boat and you'll sink up to your knees or your waist, right? These pluff mud areas. Those areas have lots of oyster larvae in the water column. But if we took a 30-pound oyster shell bag and threw it in the pluff mud, it would sink, right? So it wouldn't be available to trap oysters. And so one of the reasons that we've used repurposed crab traps or some of these modified wire traps is we can actually take those and nestle them down into the pluff mud and they won't sink and they'll actually be available to catch oysters. So we're always looking for sort of new strategies and new materials that will work in a slightly different application or a different environment in order to create new reefs. So there's not really one size fits all, I guess, is the short answer to that question.
That's great that y'all already know all that and have figured all that out. That's fabulous. So this question has to do mostly, I guess, with the downtown area. It would be helpful to address the scope of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredging. Well, maybe not. That's not downtown. When I see U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I think about that wall now. Okay. So frequency, depth, draft, locations, navigable waterways for commercial intercoastal traffic, and its effect on the marshes.
So the dredging project is permitted by the Army Corps of Engineers, not permitted by DNR. So even though DNR is a commenting agency, they're not the permitting agency for the dredging of the harbor.
Right. So
you like my side step there? It's a good one, right?
Okay, I'll let it go.
No, I mean I'm not trying. I'm not undermining the question. I'm just saying, you know, one of my big responsibilities at DNR is to sort of know my roles, and I actually asked some questions about this today because I got an email this morning about some concerned citizen that was worried about some mining that was happening in the Seawall Arwindar area, and so I actually looked into that and got a great contact from. So DNR has something called an Office of Environmental Programs, and they coordinate comments from our department on activities that are permitted by other agencies. So again, that sand mining activity in the Awandar area, that is permitted by DHEC, but DNR commented on it, and DNR did make some recommendations, and we often do that as a department. We raise concerns, we make recommendations. Sometimes those recommendations are incorporated, and sometimes they aren't, because ultimately the conditions of the permit are decided by that permitting agency, so not by us. But the other thing that I think is important to know is a lot of these activities will have public meetings, right? All of these activities will go on public notice. And so it's important for people, when they are concerned, to go to these public meetings and express their concerns, or to reach out to their municipalities, right? Because a lot of times the municipalities will carry some weight as well. So
That's true.
there are lots of things that DNR does permit, like fisheries, but activities within the coastal zone, many of those are permitted by DHEC, and DNR does comment, but ultimately we're not the permitting authority on that.
All right. So another question here about planting oysters. So can neighbors come together to plant oyster reefs in front of their eroding marshes?
It's a great question. So one of the reasons that we got asked by DHEC to do that 2015-29 project was because at the time, DHEC did not have any state-specific regulations for exactly that scenario, right? So if someone had a private property and they were losing marsh habitat and experiencing erosion, there was not a state permit with DHEC that basically allowed them to do living shorelines. And so they reached out to us and said, look, we want to promulgate some regulations that sort of describe what living shorelines are and what people can do and how they could go about doing it. Without those being in place, a property owner was left to say, I'm going to have to file an individual permit to DHEC. And individual permits take way longer because there aren't standards for them to compare against, right? There aren't specific regulations around those living shorelines. And so the only other option was to get a permit under something called an erosion control structure from DHEC. And those were written for seawalls and bulkheads. And one of the limitations of those erosion control structure permits at the time was that they stipulated that high ground had to be being lost in order to get a permit for an erosion control structure. And DHEC and DNR realized that was a huge limitation, right? If you have intertidal marsh in front of your habitat and that marsh is being lost, but you're not losing high ground, you weren't eligible for a permit from DHEC under their erosion control structure permits, right? So folks wanted to be proactive and hold what they had, not wait until they were losing their front yard and then get a seawall, right? And so we conducted all this research and understood how living shorelines will work and provided all that information to DHEC. And last year they did write their regulations for living shorelines. Those regulations were passed, I think in December, by the board of DHEC. And those living shoreline regulations have now passed to the state legislature for approval. And so if and when those regulations, and don't ask me how the state legislation operates or when they decide to do things. If and when those regulations get passed, there will essentially be state-specific regulations for living shorelines in South Carolina, so that if a property owner wants to put a living shoreline in front of their property, they will have a clear and described path to get a permit for that. And that was not the case.
Can we get some specific? Can we get specific information? We've got some good state legislators that, if we bring this to them and educate them about it, would advocate for it in the legislature. And I would think that would be useful.
Libby, I just wrote myself a note to ask our lobbyist Benton about it, and I'll get the information out.
Great.
Yeah, I don't know where they stand in terms of the legislative process, but because I work mostly with DHEC on this project, and I checked in with them in December, and they said that their board had approved them as written, so they will pass the legislature now. So, So the good news is there'll still be some logistics to figure out. So one of the things that we've scratched our head about a little bit is, so like if somebody wants to put oyster shell in front of their property, where are they going to get it from? And that's something that is a head scratcher for us, because we already as a department buy shell from out of state because there's not enough shell available in South Carolina for us to do what we want to do. And also the shell that is recycled is quarantined, right, for good reasons. We want to make sure that it's clean and doesn't have any parasites or diseases or non-native species on it. So there'll be some logistics to work out, but at least in terms of the regulatory environment, things are much better now than they were probably a couple of years ago.
Great. I'm glad that that path is opening up.
Yeah, and for me, it was really it was a really rewarding project, because like another agency came to me and said, we don't have enough information about living shorelines, and we want to write some regulations, and we want to write these regulations based on good science, and we don't have the science to do it. And that, in a nutshell, is sort of my job and our job at the Institute, is to conduct research that helps inform decisions, whether those decisions are management decisions about, fish populations or shellfish populations, or decisions about, policy or regulations, or those sorts of things. Like, that's why when I get some questions about like policy or regulations or permitting, like I try to stay in my wheelhouse of like, I try to do the science, and then I hand the science to the people that like make those decisions. And that relationship works really well, right? I try to stay in my sandbox, and other people stay in theirs, kind of thing. It's kind of how it's supposed to work.
So, what can you do for the upper parts of the creek with lower salinity? I think you might have touched on it in your presentation.
Yeah, so low salinity areas that I would say low salinity areas within sort of the estuary until fairly recently have been sort of understudied in terms of sort of shoreline erosion, and that's why we started to look at these core logs. And so these core logs are basically rolled mats of coconut husk or coconut fiber. They're essentially a byproduct of the coconut processing industry. And there was very little known about them prior to when we started working with them, sort of in the mid 2010s, around 2015, 2016, when we first started using them. They'd been used in freshwater environments a fair amount, sort of like around lakes. So obviously lakes have big fetch, and so you'll get little waves at the end of lakes, and they'll experience erosion as well. And so they've been used in that kind of environment, but they really hadn't been used in saltwater environments or estuaries prior to sort of when we started using them. Although there is a group up in Delaware, the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, that's been using them in conjunction with some mussel restoration as well as some native plantings. And so we've learned a lot about them. They work really well at trapping sediment, and so they can help stabilize sort of marsh escarpment if those are eroding. They're more buoyant than I would have expected them to be. Having carried them around, it seems like they're really heavy, but never underestimate the power of the tide to lift them up and move them around. So they move around a fair amount. And they also break down because they're natural fiber material. And so we think their life expectancy is probably about 3 years. So whereas with oyster reefs, we kind of, put the shell down there and the reefs build up, and they don't really need any maintenance or management. It seems as though these core logs, these natural fibers will require some sort of husbandry. So again, that's an important expectation, right? If you're a property owner and you say, hey, I think these core logs would be good to help sort of slow down the rate of erosion in front of my property, then we can tell folks, just be prepared that you're probably going to have to replace these every few years. So that's good information to have, right? Because it helps inform expectations on the front end.
You've almost made a plug and play project for somebody. Sounds great. So how would a living shoreline fit in the plans for the Charleston seawall?
You'd have to think about the relationship between where the seawall is and what happens with wave energy and how that would sort of impact the living shoreline, right? It's not, I've described some things we've looked at. There are definitely some combinations of things that we haven't had a chance to explore. I think it's safe to say we wouldn't want to put the living shoreline right in front of the seawall, because as you can appreciate, when waves come up against a seawall, they tend to rebound, and that area right in front of a seawall can get a lot of turbulent energy and can experience some scouring. But you know, the seawall is intended to do something a little bit different than the living shorelines, right? I mean, the seawall is really intended to keep water out of downtown Charleston, and so we've always been really careful about, you know, when we talk about the advantages of living shorelines, to not sort of oversell them, right? Living shorelines are going to help address shoreline erosion, right? They're going to protect marshes. They're going to be a strategy that will be able to migrate with sea level rise and climate change, but they're not going to stop water coming into low-lying areas, right? Because they don't change water levels, right? So sea levels are rising and downtown Charleston is flooding, and that's why they want to build a seawall. The challenge will be if there are places, from our perspective, if we wanted to do living shorelines, that if we put them in front of a seawall, what does that environment in front of the seawall look like, and how does it change once the seawall is there? But I think it's important to acknowledge that living shorelines are a great strategy in some places, but there are also some scenarios that are still going to need some engineered structures, right? And that's still true for seawalls and bulkheads, right? There are some circumstances in which, you know, high ground is being lost, people are losing their front yards, the marsh is already gone, there's a steep escarpment, right? It's going to take a lot to regrade that piece of property and put intertidal habitat back on it. You know, in some cases, maybe a seawall or bulkhead is what's needed. I think what we want to try and achieve is to not make one or other option more or less available to people just based on sort of, you know, regulatory or permitting challenges, right? We want all the options to be sort of available to folks, but acknowledging that the living shorelines are a great option in some places, but in some cases we're going to need more engineered structures as well.
Okay. So what role do you see halophytes playing in salt marsh restoration? I think we need to know what a halophyte is first.
The salt loving plants. So
okay.
Things like Salicornia, right? Those are halophytes.
Okay, halophytes.
Yeah, I don't know if I haven't really thought about their role in living shorelines. I think of them as being sort of a little bit higher in elevation than kind of where we're working. We're sort of working primarily in the intertidal zone, and I think of those halophytes as being sort of a little bit more maritime, a little bit more sort of exposed to sort of salt spray, but not necessarily sort of inundated by the tide. So, but I could be wrong. Not a halophyte expert, but.
Well, we don't. I guess we need them to keep land-based, you know, chemicals or maybe erosion or whatever from going into the marsh. So, you know, we've been talking about stuff from the water hurting the marsh, but
Yeah.
stuff from the land could hurt it.
No, I mean, definitely they're ecologically important, right? And we want to make sure that those are conserved as well. So
do you have any guidelines for transitioning from bulkhead to living shoreline?
I think that's a DHEC OCOM question.
Okay. Let's see. Does South Carolina have mangroves?
They do not.
I didn't.
Or maybe they will soon.
This one is while kayaking.
I have been approached by someone who wanted to do mangrove restoration in South Carolina. So I guess I should clarify. I don't know categorically that mangroves wouldn't survive in South Carolina. I'm just not aware of any natural populations of mangroves. But someone could make me look really bad if there are some somewhere and I don't know about them.
I do believe I've seen something about them migrating north.
The Q&A is not, the Q&A isn't part of the recording, right, Laura?
No, it is. I was just going to take over. Christine was frozen, but now she's back.
Yeah, I was thinking I was, so sorry. While kayaking Otter Island, I see big reefs of dead oyster shells. Why don't these get colonized by new oysters?
I think what the caller is referring to is probably things called shell rakes. And so in some cases, shell will get sort of washed up by sort of boat wakes and by wave energy up into sort of the higher parts of the shoreline. And that shell becomes essentially unavailable to oyster larvae, but it also becomes sort of demineralized. And so that sort of relic shell is not really that attractive to oyster larvae because it's lost a lot of its calcium carbonate content, which is the thing that oyster larvae are sort of attracted to. So yeah, we'll see these sort of shell wake areas, and there are a fair number of them in South Carolina, and they're still important habitat. I think oyster catchers use those shell rakes as sort of as habitat as well. But I think that's what that is. It's sort of the shells of oysters that have died that are being sort of washed up onto the sort of higher ground and accumulating up there.
And then there's a question about, why are the bags always sort of placed in, lines instead of maybe a zigzag pattern, or have you tried anything different?
So the bags are placed in rows like that in order to put them at sort of the optimal elevation. And so optimal in the sense that they're sort of exposed to the air for sort of a fairly optimal amount of time. And so as you'll observe when you're out and about, the vast majority of oyster reefs in South Carolina are intertidal. And there's an adaptive advantage for them to being intertidal. So when they're underwater, they get to filter and feed, obviously, but when they're underwater, they're also exposed to predators. And so there is sort of this trade-off between sort of the physiological stress of being out of the water, but also some advantages to not being predated all the time or not being susceptible to oyster diseases, which are more intense in oysters that are submerged all the time. It's a long story, but basically, long story short, this sort of mean low water elevation is really sort of the optimal place for oysters to settle and grow. And so we try to plant those bags in these sort of straight lines so that all those bags are at that sort of elevation within the tidal range, as opposed to being lower or higher than that. Plus, we're all really OCD, so we like things to be in neat lines and measure things and things to be square. So,
since you don't have enough oyster shell, is there any sort of substitute for the natural oyster shells?
So within the restoration community, there is. I mean, various states and us as well have used sort of other materials that have calcium carbonate in. So, for example, those modified crab traps are coated in concrete, and that's because the concrete that we use has a lot of calcium carbonate in it, and so that attracts oysters. We also use those Oyster Castles, but in terms of creating these large footprints, like the loose shell planning, it's challenging to think of some other materials that we can use. Prior to my time at DNR, I think there were some researchers that used some fossil shell that was sort of dredged up, but I don't think it worked as well because I think the fossil shell again has lost a lot of that calcium carbonate, so it doesn't seem to be as attractive, and it tends to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. But there have been some explorations of sort of granite and concrete and other things, but where possible, we like to use sort of what Mother Nature gave us, right? what they would choose to settle on in a natural setting. So
Right. And then someone asked a question about land trust. Are y'all working with any land trust on land that they might have marshes, marsh-owned property?
We try to work with a lot of different stakeholders at DNR. I'm struggling to think of an example, but I know we've we've worked with a number of NGOs over the years. I think including some land trusts. I'm blanking on some names, but maybe Edisto Island Preservation Alliance. I don't know if they're a land trust. We work with Low Country Institute a fair amount. We worked with Port Royal Sound Maritime Foundation. We've, as a department, we've certainly tried to acquire land over the years and put it into sort of conservation easements, and many of those areas are in the coastal zone and have sort of marshes associated with them. So I feel confident. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Didn't want to cut you off there. Oh, there's another question about the directors of DNR. So if someone wanted to find out who they were, would they just go to the website? And then they're wondering how the directors are appointed.
So the agency, the Department of Natural Resources, has an agency director, and the agency director is appointed by the board of directors of the agency. And then each of the divisions within DNR has a deputy director, and the deputy directors, I believe, are appointed at the discretion of the agency director.
Okay.
I think that means we are not, my understanding is correct, we are not a cabinet agency because our agency director is not appointed by the governor. The agency director is appointed by the board of directors.
Okay. So OCRM.
I hope I got that one right.
You probably did. I think you answered that OCRM, they approve construction of docks and seawalls, right? Just want to make sure that that was covered. And then
so they are the regulatory authority within something called the critical zone, right? So the critical area is the area within the coastal zone, and so they have the Coastal Zone Management Act, and consistency with that is under DHEC OCRM.
Okay, and then is there any entity that would act as a check on all that kind of construction besides them, or is it just them?
Well, whoever permits the activity, I mean, there will be a compliance report, I guess. So they'll have, I mean, that same agency would oversee the activity to make sure that they did what they were supposed to do.
Okay.
And that may be something where those conditions of that permit or the requirements of them may be influenced by some other commenting agencies. So if DNR, for example, was concerned about some particular impacts to natural resources, then DNR may make comments about, some recommendations about sort of when the things were done or how they were done. But again, it would fall back on the permitting agency to make the decisions about what the conditions of that permit were and to make sure that they were complied with. So compliance would be overseen by the same agency that permitted the activity, is my understanding.
Okay. So if you could realize one legislative initiative for the future, what might it be? You do the science, right? But
I'm gonna pass on that question. That's not fair to put out there.
Okay.
I don't have an answer I'm hiding, but
that's
I would say, the Institute here works on a whole diversity of taxa and organisms and lots of interests. And so I think many of those interests and goals are equally valid across those different groups. And so I don't think it would be fair for me to push, one or other of those as being more important than others. So
okay,
I'm going to pass on that.
Excellent. Well, with that, I will let everyone know that we will have the recording of your presentation on our website very soon. And I think I got to most of the questions. This has been a great presentation. I've got a lot of comments in the chat thanking you and saying how great the presentation was. So wanted to
Thank
know
you.
about that. And thank you, Evie, for coming and offering to help out. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight. We appreciate it, and hope you can get out there and volunteer with the SCORE program, and maybe eat some oysters in the near future. So I want to wish everyone a very good night, and thank you everyone again.
Thanks everybody.
Thank
I
you
enjoyed it.
guys. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Elizabeth. See you soon.
Everybody, thanks for coming.